Most people think Malaysia's economy is strong because of its factories, its palm oil, or its tourism. But the uncomfortable truth is, Malaysia's entire survival depends on one narrow strip of water, the Strait of Malacca. A choke point so small that if you zoom out on a map, it almost disappears. And yet, 80% of Malaysia's trade, its fuel, its food, its exports, its imports, everything squeezes through this tiny corridor. But here's the scary part. Malaysia doesn't even control the strait fully. And if anything goes wrong here, a military conflict, an accident, or even a single mega tanker blocking the route, the impact on Malaysia wouldn't just be serious, it would be catastrophic. So today we are going to explore a question that nobody dares to ask. What happens to Malaysia if the Strait of Malacca suddenly gets blocked? Because the truth is shocking. Malaysia's ports will freeze, its factories will stop, its fuel supplies will dry up, and the entire global economy will feel the shockwaves. In this video, we'll break down why Malaysia depends on the Malacca Strait more than any other country, what a sudden blockage would do to fuel, food, and factories, how a crisis here could drag the whole world into chaos, and why Malaysia's backup plans might not be enough to save it. Let's dive in. Now, most people think Malaysia's economy is diversified. They'll tell you about palm oil, massive electronics factories, booming tourism, and even Malaysia's surprisingly strong shipping industry. On paper, it looks like Malaysia has multiple engines powering its growth. But here's the truth Malaysia rarely advertises. All those engines run on a single lifeline, the Strait of Malacca. This narrow waterway, just a few dozen kilometers wide at its tightest point, is the artery through which nearly 80% of Malaysia's total trade moves. Not because Malaysia wants it that way, but because the geography of Southeast Asia forces it that way. Imagine Malaysia's economy as a giant machine. The Malacca Strait is the wire that connects that machine to the rest of the world. You cut the wire, the machine doesn't slow down, it shuts off instantly. But how did this tiny choke point become so important? To understand that, you have to go back centuries. The Strait of Malacca has always been more than a waterway, it's a highway of civilizations. From the ancient Indian traders to the Chinese Ming fleets, from Arab merchants to European colonizers, every major power passed through this exact route. It was the shortest sea path between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and that made it priceless. Malaysia's modern economy grew around this historical advantage. Port Klang, Penang Port, Johor's ports, they became logistics giants because they sat right next to the busiest shipping lane on Earth. Factories set up in Penang, Klang Valley, and Johor because importing raw materials and exporting finished electronics was cheap, fast, and efficient through Malacca. Refineries and industrial hubs chose Malaysia because energy shipments from the Middle East pass right by its doorstep. Malaysia didn't just grow beside the strait, it grew because of the strait. And that dependency has only gotten deeper. Today, Malaysia's fuel, food imports, industrial inputs, export goods, foreign investment, almost everything flows through this single fragile corridor. But here's the chilling part. What happens when the lifeline that feeds Malaysia suddenly stops? Because if the Malacca Strait ever gets blocked, even for a short period, Malaysia won't be facing a slowdown. It will be staring at a crisis no one is prepared for. Now imagine this. One ordinary morning, ships line up along the Malacca Strait like they always do. Oil tankers, container ships, LNG carriers, the floating blood cells of the world economy. Everything seems normal until something goes horribly wrong. A single tanker collision, a naval standoff between rival powers, a sudden military drill that spirals out of control, or even a massive ship stuck sideways just like the Suez Canal incident in 2021, but far worse. The Strait of Malacca is narrow, critically narrow. In some parts, only 2.8 kilometers wide. That means one accident or one political miscalculation is enough to freeze the entire artery. And the moment the strait gets blocked, even for 24 hours, the shock waves start. The first signs appear on marine traffic radars. Ships begin stacking up like dominoes from Singapore to the Andaman Sea. An entire line of vessels, each carrying millions of dollars of cargo, suddenly stops moving. The world's busiest shipping route becomes a floating parking lot. Oil tankers can't reach East Asia. Raw materials can't reach Malaysian factories. Export goods remain trapped in ports. And LNG carriers headed for Japan and South Korea are stranded helplessly at sea. Inside Malaysia, panic quietly spreads. Factories that depend on just-in-time supply chains notice delays within hours. Fuel companies begin calculating how long their reserves will last. Economists start texting government officials with alarming projections. But this is just the first wave. Because Malacca isn't just any choke point, it's the choke point that connects two-thirds of global trade. When it stops, the world notices. Insurance premiums skyrocket instantly. Shipping companies scramble to reroute vessels thousands of kilometers around Indonesia. Costs multiply by up to 40% and delivery times stretch by weeks. What the Suez blockage did to Europe, the Malacca blockage would do to the entire Asia-Pacific region on a much bigger scale. And in the middle of this global chaos, Malaysia sits right at the epicenter. It doesn't matter whether the cause was an accident, a regional conflict, or a diplomatic crisis, the damage begins almost instantly. But here's where things got dangerous for Malaysia. Because what happens next isn't gradual, it's immediate, and it hits the country at its most vulnerable points. When the Malacca Strait gets blocked, the world starts panicking. But for Malaysia, the clock starts ticking immediately. This isn't a slow burn crisis, it's a chain reaction that hits every weak spot in the economy one after another. The first impact: fuel. Malaysia imports a large share of its crude oil and refined fuels through Malacca. Even though Malaysia has its own energy sector, it still relies heavily on foreign shipments to balance domestic demand. So within hours, fuel companies start rationing quietly. Refineries begin running on stored reserves, and petrol stations will feel the pressure far sooner than people expect. Next comes the backbone of Malaysia's modern economy: factories. From Penang's semiconductor hubs to Johor's electronics clusters, Malaysia is a giant assembly line, and assembly lines depend on constant shipments of components. These factories operate on razor-thin just-in-time supply chains. Even a 48 to 72-hour disruption means missing inputs, halted production, and delayed exports. Billions of ringgit go up in smoke as machines go silent. Then comes something people don't expect: food. Malaysia imports more than 60% of its food needs: wheat, rice varieties, beef, fertilizers, machinery for agriculture. And most of those imports arrive by sea through Malacca. Supermarket supply chains, which usually have only days of inventory, start to strain. Prices begin to creep upward, and the government is forced to intervene to stabilize markets. Meanwhile, Malaysia's ports, especially Port Klang, Tanjung Pelpas, Johor Port, and Penang Port, become almost useless overnight. Ships can't enter, ships can't leave, and containers begin piling up at frightening speed. What normally looks like a well-oiled logistical system suddenly looks like a scrapyard of stranded containers. But the financial markets react even faster. As soon as global traders realize Malaysia's economy is exposed, the ringgit faces downward pressure. Foreign investors pull out money, and companies brace for higher costs on everything from shipping to insurance. And this is where the real pain begins: higher shipping costs. With Malacca blocked, every shipment must reroute thousands of kilometers around Indonesia. Delivery times double, shipping costs explode, and Malaysian exporters, especially palm oil, electronics, and machinery, become instantly less competitive. All of this happens not in a month, not in a week, but within hours and days. However, this is still only the beginning. Because what starts as Malaysia's crisis soon becomes Asia's crisis, and then the world's crisis. Malaysia might feel the shock first, but the ripple effect of a blocked Malacca Strait spreads faster than any tsunami. Because Malacca isn't just Malaysia's lifeline, it's Asia's fuel line, China's trade line, Japan's survival line, and the world's supply chain backbone. Once the strait freezes, the first screams come from East Asia. China's energy heart attack. China imports nearly 80% of its oil through the Malacca Strait. Without it, China's factories, the same factories that feed the world with electronics, machinery, and consumer goods, would face immediate pressure. Beijing calls this dependence its Malacca dilemma. In the scenario of a blockage, China would scramble to secure alternate routes, Central Asian pipelines, Russian oil, or rerouting ships south of Indonesia. But none of those can replace Malacca's volume or speed. China would likely deploy navy vessels instantly, not for war, but to protect its energy lifeline. But China is not alone. Japan and South Korea go into emergency mode. Japan has zero choice. Almost all of its energy passes through Malacca. A blockade means power plants lose fuel, factories lose supply, inflation skyrockets, strategic reserves are tapped early. Tokyo would immediately activate emergency maritime protocols and may even coordinate with allies to open temporary corridors. South Korea faces nearly identical consequences. But Singapore, the small giant, will fall faster. Singapore stands just next door to the strait, and it is the world's busiest transshipment hub. A Malacca closure means its ports go silent, thousands of ships bypass it, billions in logistics revenue vanish, its position as Asia's shipping capital collapses overnight. This is a nightmare scenario for Singapore's trade-based economy. Then comes the moment the world has feared for decades. The Strait of Malacca becomes a geopolitical battleground. The US, China, India, Australia, and Asian navies would all rush into the same congested waterway, each claiming to stabilize the region. But too many militaries in too small a space, that's a recipe for disaster. One miscommunication, one misfire, one accident, and Asia could face a conflict no one intended. And all of this started from a choke point barely visible on the map. But here's the twist Malaysia won't like. Even if the whole world steps in, even if global powers race to fix the crisis, Malaysia's own backup plans might not be enough to save it. You might think Malaysia has a plan B. After all, a country that relies on a single choke point this much must have some kind of backup, right? Well, yes, but the truth is uncomfortable. Malaysia has alternatives, just not ones strong enough to replace the Malacca Strait. Let's break them down. First, the Kra Canal dream, Thailand's billion-dollar fantasy. For decades, Southeast Asia has imagined cutting a giant canal across southern Thailand, a shortcut that would bypass the Malacca Strait entirely. If it existed, Malaysia could redirect much of its trade through the canal. But here's why it won't save Malaysia. Thailand can't afford the trillion baht cost. China's interest in financing it triggered political backlash. The project threatens Thailand's internal security and environmental stability. And most importantly, it's not even under construction. The Kra Canal isn't a solution. It's a PowerPoint presentation someone made 30 years ago. Second, the East Coast shift, Kuantan Port and the South China Sea. Malaysia has tried developing major ports along the east coast, especially Kuantan, with Chinese investment. It sounds smart, move some trade away from Malacca, but here's the catch. Ships from Europe, the Middle East, and Africa still need to pass through Malacca to reach Kuantan. The route becomes longer, not shorter, and the South China Sea is far more militarized than the Malacca Strait. So it helps, but only a little. Third, pipelines, rail links, land bridges. Malaysia and its neighbors have explored pipelines through Thailand or Myanmar, massive rail corridors across peninsular Southeast Asia, even ideas of a shipping land bridge. These projects sound futuristic, but they all suffer from the same weaknesses: extremely high cost, political complications, environmental risks, and nowhere near enough capacity to replace Malacca. They can support some trade, but not the millions of barrels of energy and millions of containers that Malacca handles. Fourth, the harsh reality: even if all alternatives were activated at once, even if every port, pipeline, and railway worked perfectly, they would still handle less than 10 to 15% of what Malacca moves daily. In simple terms, there is no plan B big enough to replace plan A. And that's the shocking truth. If the Malacca Strait gets blocked, the world will panic. But Malaysia, the country sitting right next to the choke point, will suffer the most. So after all this, one thing becomes crystal clear. Malaysia's greatest strength, the Strait of Malacca, is also its greatest vulnerability. It built Malaysia's ports, its factories, its trade routes, its wealth. But it also holds the power to shut the entire nation down in a matter of hours. That's the paradox Malaysia lives with every single day. A country blessed by geography and trapped by it at the same time. By the way, if you wanna know why Malaysia does not own Malacca Strait, then you can watch this video showing up on your screen. And thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button. Bye.